I'm getting a lot more orders for my briskets from friends and family these days, but I'm really having a difficult time finding time to cook them all. In order to cook just one brisket, I have to cut all the wood splits. I have to add wood splits to the fire every 20 minutes. I have to light the fire and wait an hour for the smoker to come up to temperature. I have to, in some cases, sit out there all day and babysit it, and it's just not sustainable with a new baby, a family, and a full-time job. So that got me thinking, what if I could just use my Traeger to smoke briskets, make just as good briskets on them, and spend way less time on it? That's what I'm gonna test in this video. I'm gonna smoke one brisket on my Traeger, one brisket on my Oklahoma Joe's offset smoker, and I'm gonna compare which one is better. If the Traeger brisket is just as good, or maybe even better than the offset smoker brisket, well, I might just switch over to pellet grills completely. Let's get smoking. The first brisket I cooked was on the Traeger, but I needed to solve a really big problem first. Usually I cook the brisket fat side down on my pellet smokers, in this case the Traeger, because all of that direct heat coming off of the deflector plate has a tendency to burn the bottom of the brisket, and usually that fat layer is needed to prevent it from burning. But the problem with this is that it kind of messes up the bark on the bottom fat side when you go fat side down, and it won't be exactly like my offset smoker briskets. It won't have that great crispy sugar cookie bark that everyone loves, and that is the reason that people keep coming back to me and asking me to cook briskets for them. So I need to find a way to smoke fat side up in the Traeger. That means I need to lift the brisket off the grill and put a water pan in between it and the deflector plate so that direct heat doesn't burn the brisket. I tried using some bricks to elevate a bunch of extra grates, but that didn't really work. So finally, I figured out I could just take the existing second rack in my Traeger and just flip it upside down, and then that would theoretically hold the brisket. It's pretty skinny, but my theory was that the brisket would be able to balance on it, and then I'd be able to slide that water pan in perfectly underneath it to give it a buffer, and I'd also have room for my amazing pellet smoker tray to add some extra smoke, which I'll talk about in a second. But before I put the brisket on, I had to actually trim the brisket and prepare it. I did my usual trim job on it and tried to get the fat cap as small as possible, even less than a 1/4 inch, because I really wanted it to render so I could get that nice crunchy sugar cookie bark that I often get on the offset. Now the rub I'm using for both of these briskets is 50-50 salt and pepper, the rub that I normally use, but I'm mixing in a special ingredient. In this case, one of my Patreon supporters, Tim, sent me this sample of rub. His wife makes Grill Goddess rubs. I'll link them in the description section below, and they're really awesome. They're really tasty. So I'm adding a bit of this jacked pepper rub for some kick in the rub. Then I applied the rub to the brisket, and I waited for about 30 minutes for it to dry brine a little bit and sweat out, and for the spices to mix in. After that was done, I put the brisket on the top rack of the Traeger, and I filled the aluminum tray with water, and then I added my amazing pellet smoker to help get some better smoke and bark. This is another problem with pellet smokers, and the Traeger in this case included. You often have difficulties getting a really nice dark bark because the fire pot and the pellets in the fire pot burn so cleanly. They don't give off a lot of smoke, and they don't do as good a job creating that chemical reaction with the myoglobin in the meat that creates a smoke ring. So there's multiple reasons why I'm using this additional amazing pellet smoker tray to get some extra smoke, but really it's all geared towards getting a brisket at the end of the day that looks more like and tastes more like the briskets that I can get in my Oklahoma Joe's offset smoker. Another challenge I had in order to get this Traeger brisket as good as a Oklahoma Joe's offset smoker brisket is that I need to measure the ambient temperature at the right height of the brisket. I can't just rely on the Traeger probe, which is lower down and it could be blocked off by that aluminum tray. So I'm using my meter remote probe so I can monitor the internal temperature of the brisket as well as the ambient temperature in the Traeger directly around the brisket at brisket level. After I inserted the meter and made sure it was working correctly, I set the Traeger to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and then I let it cook for a few hours before I checked on it. After roughly 2 hours, I noticed on my meter app that the ambient temperature was only around 215 degrees Fahrenheit at brisket level. My theory for this is that the ambient temperature at the brisket level that's monitored by my meter probe is much lower than it is at the Traeger probe that might be blocked off by that aluminum tray, and it's also influenced by the direct heat coming off of the deflector plate. So I think that I need to turn up the actual Traeger temperature to 275 or maybe even 300, and that would translate into maybe like a 225 or 250 at brisket level. So that's what I did in this case. I cranked up the temperature to 275 degrees Fahrenheit. And then after around 3 hours, I checked the brisket again and I spritzed the edges. The bark was looking really good. It was a really deep mahogany red, and it didn't look like it was drying out as fast as my Traeger briskets usually do. So I could see that I was doing something right here. It might have been the extra water from the water pan or the fact that the brisket was raised up, but this just looked a lot better. 5 hours in, I replaced the pellet tray with fresh pellets because I wanted to keep that extra smoke going. And I also added more water to the water pan, which had evaporated quite quickly. I actually had to do this a few times during the cook. I found that it was creating a lot more moisture within the cooking chamber, but it was the water that was in that water pan was burning off quite quickly. And around 7 hours in, I noticed a lot of pooling on top of the brisket, and I was worried that the bark wouldn't form properly. So I propped it up with a piece of cherry wood to help it drain off, and I let it run for another about half an hour. And then at that point, I was happy with how the bark looked. I was happy that the moisture wasn't pooling as much. The fat looked like it was on its way to rendering. It wasn't great, but I had to wrap it at this point, so I wrapped it in tallow and butcher paper. After wrapping it, it went into the oven to finish cooking at 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And after about an hour and a half, I did my finishing checks and I decided that the brisket was done. So I ripped open the top of the butcher paper to vent it for about 15 minutes, and then I covered it with a towel and let it rest for 2 hours. When I finally sliced into it, it looked pretty similar to the offset smoker briskets that I normally cook and everyone loves, but I noticed there was almost no smoke ring around the meat, and the bottom was still a little bit overcooked and tough. It wasn't burnt, but you could tell it was getting more heat. It must have been from the water pan, or there must have been more heat circulating underneath the brisket as opposed to over top of it. Whatever the reason was, it was a little bit tough on the bottom, unfortunately. And unfortunately, I also overcooked this brisket a little bit. I probably left it in the oven about 30 minutes too long, and it was a little bit overcooked and had a little bit of that pot roasty type flavor. But overall, it looked really good, and my wife agreed. Now, with the Traeger brisket done, I saved a couple of slices that I'll use for the taste test comparison at the end of this video, and then I moved on to smoking the Oklahoma Joe's offset smoker brisket. Now for this brisket, I trimmed it the exact same way as the Traeger brisket. I used the same Grill Goddess rub. Thanks again, Tim, for sending me that. It's really tasty. And then I let it sweat out and dry brine for about 30 minutes before I put it on the smoker. While I waited for the brisket to dry brine, I prepped my Oklahoma Joe's by wiping the snow off. It was pretty cold that day, and I cleaned the grates and filled my charcoal basket with Jealous Devil lump charcoal. To light it, I knew it would be challenging in the cold weather to use a chimney, so I pulled out the big guns. This is a grill gun from grillblazer.com. I'll link it in the description section below. It's a really awesome and fast way to light charcoal. If you want to light your charcoal extremely fast under cold weather conditions, this is definitely the right tool for the job. It hooks up to a standard size propane tank or a propane bottle if you want portability, and it puts out around 400,000 BTUs of charcoal lighting fury. It's pretty crazy, and it's also really fun to use. Once the charcoal was lit, I put the brisket on the far left of the smoke chamber, and I inserted my meter probe to monitor the internal and ambient temperature. Then I managed the fire pretty much all day, looked after my son, ran back and forth adding splits every 20 minutes. I wrapped it, I finished it in the oven, pretty much the standard way that I cook all of my briskets on my Oklahoma Joe's. All right, time to do a quick taste test. The first one I'm gonna test is the Traeger brisket. This is a piece of the flat. It's really good. It's got a lot of flavor. The smokiness is a little bit bitter almost. It's definitely prominent and smoky, but it's not the smokiness that I usually get from my offset smoker. The fat on the brisket flat, you can sort of see how it kind of peels off like that. That means it's not fully rendered, so it didn't render as well, but it's still really tasty. I could eat that. It's nice and flavorful. I'm gonna try the point muscle now from that Traeger brisket. It's good. Again, the fat just isn't as rendered as I usually like it. Now I'm gonna try the Oklahoma Joe's brisket. Again, this is a piece of the flat. I cooked this one a little bit better. I didn't overcook it as much, so it doesn't have as much of that hot roasty flavor. I overcooked the Traeger one a little bit, but you can see with the fat cap here, it's really hard to peel off. It's almost like squishy, and that's because it's fully rendered. And as a result, it tastes a lot better. It's really good. In conclusion, let's start with the Traeger brisket. The things that I liked. The first thing that I liked is it was super easy to make. All I had to do is set it and forget it. It was super easy cook. I just spent the whole day with my family while the Traeger did the rest of the work. So that is a huge selling point of the Traeger. The second point that I really liked is once I got it off, lifted off of that heat deflector plate and the bottom grill and got some airspace, especially with that pan in the middle as a deflector, then the brisket cooked a lot more evenly than briskets I have cooked in the past. It was still a little bit overcooked on the bottom because I think a lot of direct heat and steam was getting to the bottom of the brisket more so than the air that was circulating to the top. But overall, cooked pretty evenly. It tasted great. It was really good. I overcooked it a little bit. It tasted a little bit pot roasty, but that was my fault. It wasn't the Traeger's fault. And it was really good. My family really liked it too. So bad points about the Traeger brisket. You have to do a little bit of setup in order to get it how you like it, because I had to fiddle around in order to get it lifted off of the grate so it wouldn't have as much direct heat and burn the bottom of the brisket. I had to refill that water pan a couple times during the cook because it evaporated off pretty quickly. I also had to set up the amazing pellet smoker, and I had to refill that 3 times, I think, during the course of the cook. The second thing that I didn't really like about the Traeger brisket was that it didn't have a smoke ring for some reason. I don't actually know why it didn't have a smoke ring. Most of the Traeger briskets, all of them actually, that I've cooked in the past have a really prominent, really pink smoke ring. I think my theory in this case, why it didn't have a pink smoke ring is because I think I was burning it too hot at 275, 300 degrees. That burn pot was almost near complete combustion. It wasn't producing a lot of the gases that interact with the myoglobin on the brisket and produce that chemical reaction. That's really the only thing I can think of. Or the heat deflector, my makeshift deflector, was blocking all of the smoke and gases, and they were just going one way. But that wouldn't make much sense because the rest of the brisket was getting a lot of heat. So if you guys have any suggestions or ideas on why it didn't get a smoke ring, let me know in the comments. I'd be really interested to know that. Another thing that was kind of disappointing about the Traeger brisket, it was just a little bit bitter. The smoke flavor wasn't really, it was smoky, but it was just like, it hit your tongue. It was a bit acrid, like it was just a bit bitter. It wasn't that nice, subdued smoke flavor that you usually get on an offset smoker, or maybe like a water smoker or something that you use burning wood and charcoal with. So that's pretty much the Traeger over with. Let's talk about the Oklahoma Joe's now. The Oklahoma Joe's brisket. Number 1, flavor. That's why we cook on offset smokers. The smoke flavor wasn't bitter. It was really good. The smoke flavor came through. Second good thing, the sugar cookie bark. You got really good sugar cookie bark on this brisket. It rendered fully, and it just kind of falls apart in your mouth, whereas the Traeger brisket, I did everything I could to get that kind of bark and create the same cooking temperature as the Oklahoma Joe's and do some indirect cooking. but I still couldn't really render out that fat effectively. And the Traeger brisket fat kind of peeled off, unfortunately. It was still really good though, but it just wasn't to the point where the Oklahoma Joe's brisket was at in terms of that sugar cookie bark that I'm always looking for. And the third point is it just tasted better. I think I cooked it a little bit better because I took it off earlier and I didn't overcook it. But again, that's not the Traeger's fault. That's just because I happened to cook the Oklahoma Joe's brisket better. So thanks so much for watching, guys. And thank you in particular to my Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and I enjoy having conversations with you in our private chat channel on our Discord server. If you guys want to check out my Patreon, it's linked in the description section below. Thanks so much for watching and we'll see you in the next video. Happy smoking, guys.